Okay, so we are rolling now. I'm recording this for those who aren't able to make it. Um, Again, this is working with land managers for trail projects. I'm your host, Ben Sugar, and thank you for joining us. Now that everyone's got their name in the chat there, it's going to move right along. Feel free to raise your hand if you have a question or something, or since it's a small group, you may just, whenever you hear a break and me flapping my gums, you can feel free to just, pipe in and ask your question, or have a comment if you have something to add, because, it's possible that I've gotten something wrong. It's not impossible at all. So some housekeeping items before we really get rolling. This is, again, going to be recorded and made available in our online learning library website. So if you just Google NYNJTC online learning library, you should be able to find it there, as well as a bunch of other courses that were recorded, especially in 2020 during the first part of the pandemic when everything was online. But we've kept it up because people have really enjoyed it. And speaking of supplementary resources, the email I sent out a little while ago should have had some attachments and useful links, some of which I'll be referring to here today. And included was an attached PDF copy of this presentation, along with the presentation notes. So hopefully, if you, rather than watching the webinar, if you want to just run through that to find something that was included, that should be helpful, hopefully. So here's what we're going to cover. I'm going to run quickly through the trail conference, and then I will introduce myself, and we'll go around quickly, and everyone will introduce themselves and what their role is and what their interests are if people are coming from outside the trail conference or the state. Talk a little bit about what this workshop is, and then I'll get into the meat of the presentation, which is kind of general questions and preparation and process for trail projects in terms of running them by your land manager and navigating that whole process. There's a lot of things that are common across jurisdictions, across state lines, and that's with a big asterisk that it's, your mileage may vary. Then we'll get into the specifics of New York Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation and what their process and their people, what they are, because that is the primary topic that we're covering here. This is something that's mandated for us to put on by OPRHP, and so we're doing it primarily for them. Once we've gone through those specifics, I'll cover briefly some notes about other jurisdictions and agencies that are worthy of note, specifically New York DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, and New Jersey DEP, Department of Environmental Protection. All right. So first of all, hopefully most of you are familiar with the New Jersey Trail Conference. I'll go briefly through this. More information is always available on our website, nynjtc.org. So we've been developing, building, maintaining trails since 1920. We do a lot of work protecting trail lands and trail experiences for people interested in recreation through support and advocacy, and educating the public of responsible use of trails and the natural environment. Trail conference today, we're pretty big, we're pretty expansive, we do a lot of good work. I don't want to get into the individual numbers, so I have a lot to get through. And we cover 2,100 miles of trail plus, and this is from an old presentation, so I don't even know exactly what the number is now. It's more than that. One thing worth noting is down here on the bottom right, this metro region is no longer part of our trail regions. We have given that up to the Natural Areas Conservancy because bandwidth wise, it was beyond what we were able to take care of. But as you can see, otherwise throughout the region, we cover a lot of real estate, and some of that includes long distance trails, including the AT, Highlands Trail, and the Long Path, and the Shawangunk Ridge Trail. And our mission statement, especially as it pertains to this, is Trail Conference is a volunteer-powered and volunteer-directed organization that builds, maintains, and protects public trails together with our partners. So it involves cooperation. We strive to ensure trails and natural areas we share are sustainable and accessible to enjoy for generations. All right, so here's my ugly mug. My title is Senior Trail Builder. I am kind of a technical specialist for some larger and more technically intensive trail projects with the Trail Conference. Specifically, I oversee our program that runs Conservation Corps trail crews with AmeriCorps members. And we tend to run anywhere between 2 and 5 crews per season. But there are many other crews out working that are completely volunteer driven. And I have limited experience with those, but what we're talking about today does affect them. I have been with the Trail Conference since 2018, and in this capacity since the end of 2019. Previously, I've worked building trails and managing trails in New England and the Mid-Atlantic and out in Utah, dating all the way back to 2003. So it's been a long time. Actually, let me go back really quickly. So can we go around really fast and just have people introduce themselves? I'll just start at my upper left. So Rich, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Rich Jobski. I have 2 volunteer functions with the Trail Conference. I'm the chair of the West Hudson Regional Trails Council. That council is a body of leaders, volunteer leaders, primarily in the Trail Conference north of the New York-New Jersey border and west of the Hudson River. We hold meetings several times a year and discuss issues of interest. I also have an additional volunteer job as a trail supervisor in Sterling Forest.
Thanks. Ed, how about you?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ed Spurko. I'm the local trails chair for West Hudson South, which includes Bear Mountain, Sterling Forest, and Harriman, and also the Rockland County parks that border on it. So my main job is to coordinate with all the maintainers and the 4 supervisors, and try to get as much done and understand what you folks want, and just try to understand how I can help.
Right, thank you. Jackie.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jackie Hanley, and I work, I'm a colleague of Ben Sugar. I work for the Trail Conference. I'm the grant and contract manager. I've been with the Trail Conference. I still feel new, but on the other hand, I've been there 8 months. But a session like today is so helpful for me to, as much as I could learn and all the pockets of how we work and how everything is put together in any class. And so I've certainly recognized people's names here. It's great to see the faces, and any class with Ben Sugar I enjoy doing. So if it's online or if it's on the side of a trail, and there's always so much to learn from Ben. I really have to say that. So look forward to today.
All right, thank you. Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew Ferguson. I've been a long-term, I guess, trail maintainer in the Storm King area, and I recently signed on as the trail supervisor on Scunnamunk. So for me at this point, this is more of a, I guess, an informational session.
Perfect.
But, you know, I'm
Oh,
looking forward to just kind of continuing my journey.
Great. Valerie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Valerie Knowles. I'm the Regional Trails Coordinator for the Palisades region in New York. My job includes working with partners like the Trail Conference to work on trail projects and making sure the trails are being built and maintained.
Thank you. Hopefully I'll get your name correct. Helena? Are you there, Jelena? Might not be around. Okay, how about other Andrew?
Hello, everybody. My name is Andrew Crosby. I'm a seasonal assistant over in Cheesequake State Park in the central region. I do a variety of things at the park. I'm just trying to broaden my spectrum on, how all this actually goes down. So I'm just very informational lesson. Yeah, no, I'm really involved within the community too. I just recently hiked the Appalachian Trail this year. So yeah, I'm just really excited to know exactly how to how this all goes down, and just I'm really excited to learn from everybody. All right.
All right, great. All right. So if Jelena's not able to introduce herself, I will simply move on. Hopefully she's able to hear me. All right. Oops. Stop sharing by accident. Let's try that again. All right. All right, so who's this workshop for? It's for participants from a wide range, either within the trail conference, outside the trail conference, especially if you are involved in some sort of trails organization, trail conference or not, help understand the relevant land managers' requirements, their steps, and the people involved to successfully propose and execute significant trail projects on primitive or natural surface trails on their property that they're responsible for. It's specifically focused on New York State Parks or OPRHP's Taconic Palisades regions, but we do touch on other jurisdictions and processes and trying to discuss general principles and best practices wherever possible. It's volunteers and friends group organizations that aspire to carry out significant work to benefit park trails. But still, those of you working elsewhere and interested in elsewhere will find helpful information here, and feel free to ask questions as we go. So what are we going to cover? What does it cover? What kinds of projects fall under this umbrella and could be desirable to carry out? What the review processes and steps are, and what kind of people are involved and need to be kept in the loop, and generally what wheels will turn by themselves for the most part. And then recommendations for proposing concepts, field review, and any necessary permitting application, what to expect more or less. And then maybe some pitfalls to anticipate and avoid in proposing a project. So there's a few things that we're not going to be discussing. So we're not going to be discussing routine maintenance, usually stuff that's covered under memorandums of understanding with trail groups or with individual volunteers. So your clipping and blazing and clearing of tree fall and that sort of thing falls generally under routine maintenance. And so we're not covering that because usually that's taken care of under a separate agreement or separate process. We're not going to be covering projects on the Appalachian Trail or other national scenic trails, national historic trails, or national recreational trails, in part because I'm less on a sure footing discussing the process that falls with the National Park Service generally, but also those trails have very specific processes that are pretty detailed and thorny, and I'm less comfortable discussing them with any confidence. We won't be discussing trails on hard surface or paved asphalt or other non-trail infrastructure, at least for the most part. You might be able to extend this to certain infrastructure like trailheads, but other than that, for the most part, we're talking trails themselves. We're not talking about projects on privately held open space, although some of this is probably best practices that extends there, but I would be very careful trying to generalize too much. We are not talking about the specifics for federal Americans with Disability Act standards and requirements. And we're not going to get into the nitty gritty of trail layout and design and sustainable trail design. We cover that in other workshops on layout and design, trail structures, and other types like that. If you're interested and that's what you're looking for, there are other workshops that we put on throughout the year to cover that. Any questions so far? Okie doke. Moving on. So why are we doing this? What is the point? The short answer is the state is making us do it. We have a contract with OPRHP, and as one of their requirements is they would like us to put this on to help volunteers and prospective volunteers understand what their process is for successfully proposing, having reviewed, and then implementing more significant trail projects. And the long answer is, well, we do this, we don't just go out and start building because the public agencies are the, sort of the stewards of the public trust to manage and gatekeep activities on the land that they've been put in charge of. And from a practical standpoint, developing a good working relationship that's not just based on trust, but is also efficiently run will produce good outcomes overall. And people will, understand each other and understand the steps in these processes, and we'll all get better trails. So that's a non-allied good. So when talking about a trail project, the first thing to start with is, what is the nature of it? What are you actually trying to accomplish? If it's your idea, or if it's something that's being proposed to you by the agency, are you trying to build a new trail or a connection between trails, a reroute, and why are you rerouting that trail? Is it a tread or a drainage improvement to an existing trail? Are you installing or constructing some sort of structure, or maybe replace something that's already in place with something similar or an upgrade? Or are you trying to actively close, renaturalize, and rehabilitate something? So knowing that going in will help you articulate and navigate a lot of what comes next. So the other side of that is, where the more general thing is, why? What's the benefit to the user public behind the idea? Are you trying to improve safety? Are you trying to better protect the natural resource, or just the trail resource for user access and overall sustainability over time? Or are you trying to improve connectivity between different trailheads, parking areas, from one trail to another? Are you trying to meet an unmet need for a underserved community, maybe a user group? So knowing what is the rationale going in helps a lot. Especially helps you sell the idea. So in terms of first steps, and I'm going into first, these are general ideas. This is not OPRHP specific. If, let's say, you're a volunteer or a volunteer group and you have an idea, in general, you would reach out to the park manager or relevant staff to feel out what the level of support is. Is this something that they're receptive to? Is it a small project? Are you simply just making some drainage improvements on an area of wet trail, but it's just big enough of a project that you have to go through some sort of review process? Or are you proposing a brand new trail? If so, that's going to be a bigger lift, and you're less likely to have success unless it's something that's in some sort of management document as a recommendation. So that's B, is finding out what planning or management documents, if any, guide trail development, management, and trail development and management in that park. Most of these are available online, or you can ask staff if they know where they are. I've already supplied you all links to pretty much most of what's out there, at least what I believe, with the exception of anything that's like Park Service, National Park Service. You can talk to them about what the agency's existing trail priorities are in that area, kind of where they are in their process, and how you or your organization can help. And then maybe weigh that against what your idea is. And it could be potentially you scratch my back and I scratch yours. So if you have things that you would like to get done, you can talk to them about what they would like to have done, and maybe both can get done eventually, decide what the order is. So here are some examples of the sorts of documents that you may want to consult to see what's already on the books. So on the left is a Sterling Forest Comprehensive Trail Plan from 2009, and on the right says DEC's, just a screenshot of DEC's page for all their recreation and unit management plans. And there's a number of reasons to consult these and to go off of what they recommend in terms of your projects, in part because it's already been vetted overall, but and it's easier to get approved when you propose something. But also the environmental reviews typically already been done, at least in large part, and you can by and large skip a lot of that step. Trail development standards and management standards are also important. So this is a little hard to read, but these are different trail classes for various types of trail in terms of how wide the trail should be, how high up it should be cleared, sight distances, guidance for surfacing materials. Those things should give you an idea of if you're building or renovating an area of trail, to like what is the general character of trail you should attempt to keep. Now, these are guidelines. It just mostly should inform you, and you should try to keep from grossly deviating from these and producing something that's vastly out of character for what's been prescribed. All right. So other first steps, no matter who you're working with, is know who needs to be involved from the agency. Do they have natural resource specialists or cultural resource specialists who need to be involved that you need to worry about? Or do you have one point of contact, either a land manager or someone or a park manager or someone else who is your main point of contact, and they will deal with discussing with anyone else who's necessary. Assuming you're on trail conference adopted trails where there is a management structure with us, be sure to keep the local trail chairs, or usually the local trail chairs, informed and involved in the project at all stages, ideally from from jump, so that they know what is being done in the trails that they are responsible for in terms of assisting with management as volunteers. Here is a map to give you a better idea of, this is a very simplified version of the type of management structure that the Trail Conference has. So overall, in all of northern New Jersey, that is a regional, that is a RTC region, so Regional Trail Council, yes. And then within that, there are local trail chairs who are responsible for subsets of that, and also subregions within that. So Ed and Rich both serve, Rich serves as an RTC and an LTC, and with very different hats that they wear. And Ed is a local trail chair as well. Anything either of you two would want to add on to that?
No, just that it does help the project go smoothly if everyone working on it does keep us in the loop.
Yeah, and that's just to add to that. I mean, the one thing Rich does as an RTC chair is he hosts a meeting almost monthly, and it's a really good way for everybody to talk and get on board and understand what projects are going on.
All right. Move along. So even early on, whatever land management representative you're talking to, usually they're not going to want to just have a description like, there's a site out in the woods, I think you should build a bridge, or there needs to be some drainage work. They want to know specifics, and before you drag them out there to walk it themselves, they would usually appreciate some sort of documentation, whether that's a digital or even a hand-drawn site map of the area, over a map of some kind, kind of showing relationally what it is you're talking about and where. GPS data is usually very helpful if you can provide points or tracks for the project that you're proposing or the project need. If what you're doing is documenting existing conditions and the need for a project to address them. various apps and services are useful for this, especially if you don't have GIS capability or the ability to make GIS or ArcMap. Trail Conference uses Avenza for our own maps, and it's great, but there are other services. Trail Forks is quite good. The bike community tends to use that a lot, partly because you have good topo-based maps that you can use and you customize the data within that. Gaia works serviceably well, although I haven't used it really myself. And Google Earth, they all function well for GPSing and displaying geographic data for you to be able to transmit over to land managers and others to communicate details or location details of the project. And of course, photos of before conditions, the proposed area. Sometimes if you have rough measurements, that can be good too. Now, a lot of this, it's worth mentioning that, you know, some organizations, some groups, and the land manager may have or maybe should establish regular meetings between themselves and other stakeholders to regularly go over proposals, because there's, you know, oftentimes more than one thing going on. So all of this could not just be a one and done process. It could be just iterative, you know, every single spring or every fall and spring, get together and go over these for, you know, maybe a half a dozen or more different proposals. So that's a caveat, but I'm trying to keep things simple here. General next steps is, you know, if, let's say your land manager bites and says, okay, that sounds interesting, or it sounds like it's worthy of taking a look at, you may schedule a site visit with the land manager, or, you know, other, if you're in the TC organizational structure, to, you know, bring out the local trail chair and have them take a look with you to kind of get on the same page in terms of general location and affirm that there's a need for the project, other basics like that. If it's a reroute with new trail development, and let's say you've maybe you've got a corridor to propose as a solution, you might walk through that and do an initial review of feasibility, or maybe explore some other options. And the staff and other individuals that attend will really vary, depend on the jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions may not want to go out and do a site visit. They may not have the bandwidth to do that. I'm looking at you, DEP. That tends to not be something that they do. But your mileage may vary. At this stage, you should also just usually be considering the logistics, and you probably do, but if it's your first time doing this and mostly you're being led by a great idea, you need to really consider who's going to do this work. If you've got a pie in the sky idea to really improve these trails, you need to think about who's going to put in the sweat equity, or what sort of resources you're going to bring to bear in order to do that, in terms of tools, equipment, and maybe expertise if it's technical. And based partly on that, what's the potential cost and the timeline associated with all of this work in order for it to be done? So all that feeds into how feasible is this? Or maybe you should consider, if a lot of these are unknown, or you don't have a lot of good options, you may want to temper your ambition and try and find something that's not going to be quite so shooting for the moon. Maybe you don't want to put in or propose to put in a 50-step series of staircases. Maybe you need an option that's going to fix things for the short term until you figure that out, or maybe you can wait and try and work on this part of things long term and address it later. So one of the best next things to do, and it's good to do this early on in the process, just so you know what you're dealing with early, is do a sensitive resource check. And a lot of times your land managing agency will do this. They're going to do this as their part of the review process, But if you're able to do it, you can kind of get ahead of the curve and know what to anticipate or what to avoid, especially if you are proposing some sort of new route. So these online resource mappers, in fact, I did send links to these. As long as you kind of figure out how to use them, if you're a tech-oriented or a map-oriented person, you can figure out how to turn these layers off and on fairly easily. And they can tell you if you are dealing with wetlands or named water bodies and what class of water body are you looking at. Occasionally cultural resources, although usually those aren't mapped. They try to avoid putting cultural resource geographic data on there because they don't want people relic hunting, that sort of thing. But threatened and endangered species, especially at a statewide level, can be really important. Although in my experience, turning on that layer on these maps tends to make the whole map like light up, bright pink, because there's always something that's technically a high quality habitat and you require some clarification from the managing agency. So this New York Environmental Resource Mapper is generally good for anything within the state. New Jersey has a general GeoWeb that's helpful. And then within the Highlands region, they have an additional interactive map that is really quite excellent, at least from what I can remember. Any questions on that? All right. Moving forward, before you make any sort of real submission that's anything resembling anything official, you want to be able to articulate what sort of anticipated impacts or disturbances what you're proposing is going to inflict on the landscape or upon the user public. If in terms of environmental disturbance, usually, at least most of what we do, is going to involve soil disturbance, harvesting rock materials, and some vegetation trampling. And normally within limits, those are taken as part of the cost of doing business, but you need to be able to say that that those are what you can expect. Typically impacts to trees and water bodies, particularly wetlands and named streams and lakes. Those are going to be, they're going to set off additional like environmental review. So always avoid impacting more mature trees above just saplings and water bodies whenever you can. That's just universal. Cultural issues, prehistoric artifacts, Native American sites, and any sort of more contemporary historic structures. Obviously, you want to avoid anything that's going to impact those, or at least potentially impact those, but you need to keep that in mind and avoid it if all possible. And then there's just some of the logistics of doing the work and what are the impacts to the trails and the social implications. Are you going to be disrupting people's recreational experience while you're doing the work, and to what degree? Are you going to be taking up the trailhead every weekend with volunteers so that people wanting to use the trails can't? Are you planning on changing things such that the trails themselves are so different that they might not be recognizable? Are people going to be upset by that? Is what you're doing going to change the blazing scheme for the trail network? All those things are things to consider. They may not change too much of what you do or don't do, but I think being sensitive to that is useful to hopefully plan on some mitigation if it's at all possible. All right, so if you make a general submission, you've identified that maybe there's potential resource or impact concerns with the land manager, and they've gone through and done an initial review. Oftentimes they look at the same sort of maps you do, but usually a little bit more sophisticated, and they can tell you if there are resource concerns with what you're proposing, where you're proposing it, and the sort of impacts that you're proposing. That's when you kind of start doing the horse trading and deciding on what's an acceptable eventual project outline. so that you can still go ahead with what you would like to do, or what's been proposed, but you've also addressed those concerns. And oftentimes that's going to involve some sort of site visit to look at where the specific areas of concern are and tighten up your marking with flags or what have you to make sure that you avoid those. So that regulatory review usually is a walkthrough with some sort of natural resources staff, not already done. Again, not universal, but usually it happens. If it's deemed necessary, you may need to do a full resource impact review. And these take slightly different names and different forms depending on the jurisdiction. The federal kind of basis for many of these is called NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act. And NEPA is also the name of the process. There's usually an environmental assessment of some kind, but there's state-based versions of these. New York State has one called SEQR, S-E-Q-R-A, where the A is for act. It's normally just S-E-Q-R, State Environmental Quality Review. And New Jersey DEP also has an environmental assessment, and they work through something called land use regulation protection. I'm getting that acronym wrong, but they've got their own versions of these. And understanding what triggers those and how to navigate that process is very helpful. Sometimes you can avoid it, and I would say the shorthand is the best way to avoid these is work through, if there's an existing plan, a master plan or a trails plan in place, following the recommendations back by that helps at least some of the time avoid having to go through these processes. Because oftentimes, at least in New York, that review has already been done in the process of creating that plan document. Others this is one of those areas where feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, because this is an area where I could be wrong. Finally, based on all of that, you can determine are any permits needed. And especially, as I said, when it comes to tree cutting or impacts to water bodies, wetland or riparian areas, those buffers, that's when you're going to start getting into permits. And it's not impossible to get permits for these things, but it does add an extra hoop. There's a lot more paperwork to fill out, and there's more people who have to look at the proposal and sign off on it. So rule of thumb, if you can avoid having to do permits, go for it. Things to avoid if possible. Again, wetlands, buffers, flood zones, and depending on the area, especially in New York, sunny, exposed, rocky areas where to propose work in talus fields, also because there's statewide threatened and endangered reptiles that you want to avoid impacting their habitat, especially if your work involves a large amount of harvesting rock or moving the trail in some way. Large water crossings should also be avoided for a number of reasons, partly just logistics, but also you're going to get into more permits if you are crossing significant water bodies. Sometimes you have no choice though. Some other potential documentation needs that may be asked of you is a more detailed photo work log, or some sort of structural drawing or schematic with measurements if you're proposing building structures. And then based on that, a catalog of materials needs for like lumber and fastener hardware, especially if the agency is paying for materials for you. Here's just a couple of examples. Here's a schematic for a simple stretch of boardwalk or bog bridge, and the specifications based on that for what's needed to actually construct that, what type of lumber, what type of fasteners, and then also the load limits. This is a little more detailed than is always necessary, but it's nice to see. And then just here's an example of, the documentation that would go in terms of the documenting the need and where you would actually place the structure. There's photos with markup. So general, going over final approval and execution. Eventually, you're very likely at least better off with some sort of signed form or agreement, signing off on the project, especially if it's questioned. Your mileage again may vary. They may be informal, say, no, go for it, go and fix the trail for sure. But during the project, as things progress, keep the agency staff and whoever is your point of contact with the trail conference, if it's relevant, keep them updated regularly with reports, photos on progress, measurements, and let them know when there's completion. You always want to follow any sort of documentation and safety processes required by the agency, including personal protective equipment or paperwork if you need to sign some sort of release to be a volunteer on their property, or if you need to make sure that others coming to do the work do so. Just a reminder. If you're rerouting or building a new trail, eventually you may be requested to supply a GPS track of the new route so that the agency can update their trail inventory. All right, time check, 1:48. Would it be okay if we took a 5-minute break just for folks to refresh? All right, well, I am. I'm going to
Sounds good.
Meet back here in about 5 minutes, about 7 till.
Perfect.
It's fine here.
All right, looking at 7 till. So just a second, we'll get started again. I will say I apologize that this is so dry. It's a pretty dry topic, unfortunately, and I racked my brains to try and make this more interactive and multimedia, but I haven't come up with any great ideas yet. And this is the first time I'm putting this on. So hopefully everyone's still caffeinated enough from the morning to not nod off during this. But give folks another 30 seconds or so and we'll get started. Okay, now we're going to get into the real raison d'etre for why we're doing this. Oh, did we lose somebody? Oh, Andrew Crosby. Okay, so now we're launching into talking about the OPRHP process. So be prepared to disregard roughly 20% of what I just told you. Because there is a specific process for OPRHP that differs in some important ways from that kind of general hypothetical process that I've been describing. So OPRHP in general has some online trail technical assistance documents online, and they're available at this address. This was in my email to everyone. 2 of them stand out as being relevant. One is the standards and guidelines for trails in New York State Parks. Remember that big table I showed you with all the guidelines for trail measurements? That's relevant. The other, which is at least partially relevant, is the Trails Technical Document number 7, Trail Project Approval Process for New York State Parks. Much of that is still quite correct and useful. However, there are some things about it that have kind of been superseded or changed. And this, in this process, I think, Valerie, you may be helpful. In that document, they include a couple of flowcharts for what the general process is for trails, both in a trails plan and for projects not in a trails plan. Disregard these because it is slightly different now. This is a slightly older document and we have different personnel who oversees this. Similar for when trails are not part of a trails plan. Disregard that. So just don't follow those flow charts and don't feel as though it's exactly the way things work. The updated flow chart, at least as I best understand it, goes as follows. So this is a project is in a trails plan. Staff or trail organization or individual volunteer, I guess hypothetically, proposes a trail project to the regional trails coordinator. They conduct an initial review of the project with the park manager and national resources staff, kind of internally, and they could conduct a site visit, with whoever the proposing representative to review that proposition. The project details get adjusted based on staff concerns and any identified issues that were unanticipated. Maybe you do another site visit, but in general, the review process is pretty truncated because the project is already in a trails plan. And then the regional trails coordinator works with the park manager to approve the project via a work plan document. And we'll get into that. Now, the difference is if the project is not in a trails plan, you go through the same process, but once you started on a review, if staff has substantive concerns and consults with, hold on. I guess I'll just launch into the process notes. It's worth noting that, actually, I'm gonna go back one. If the staff has substantive concerns and consults with specialists about the environmental, cultural, other impacts of the project, it takes a little longer and you may go through that seeker process, SEQR. And there's also, at least some chance that the project is not approved here on the left. It's just, it's one more complication because the project is not in a trails plan. It's not as much of a gimme that it is something that is going to be in the best interests of, the public, the agency, what have you. But otherwise, the rest of the process looks at least somewhat similar. So some notes about the process. Again, it's emphasizing that the regional trails coordinator is your OPRHP contact for any such projects. And worth noting here that the regional trails coordinators in the Palisades region is Valerie. So if you're on camera, wave, Valerie. And in the Taconic region, it's Nate Wenzel. They are your portal to good trail things happen in terms of interfacing with OPRHP. They will handle discussing the project with natural resources folks and the park manager, although you may interact with them and coordinate, especially once the project is in process. Also worth noting here, the contact information for the region chairs. So in the Palisades, it's Rich. So there's his information. And in the Taconic region, it's Michael Pashley. So east of the river, everything from Westchester up to Dutchess, east of Hudson would be Michael Pashley. So I mentioned an annual project work plan. This is what that looks like, and it is an appendix to that new and rerouted trails guidelines that's in that technical assistance page that I mentioned. This is what they want you to fill out and submit. And we're just going to go through it briefly. I include this kind of towards the beginning of this process because the old process has everyone submitting this initially when you're first proposing the idea. In my personal experience, it's not always needed to have this done until things have been kind of hammered out and fully revised. And eventually you want it completed and signed, but I'm including it here because it is good for structuring and answering some of these questions. So all the contact information, GPS coordinates, type of work being done. This is good for just sort of organizing your proposition anyway. So even if it's not 100% required to submit this, it's probably still good practice. And then the key question down here, scope of work included in trails plan. So finding that out is a good thing to start with. Worth noting that as of right now, Harriman does not have a trails plan. It is being worked on. Very early days, but eventually there will be some kind of trails plan for part or all of Harriman. Stay tuned. All right, and then the bottom of this form, description of work, be specific, and what they want to know about are the impacts. So rock moving, tree cutting, trail work within 100 feet of water body, bridges, retaining walls, all that stuff. They want a map, a digital photo, and then eventually they want something after, and then signatures. Now this is an older document, so they're talking about the regional natural resource steward and capital facilities manager. That if that happens, it's internal, but that's where your regional trails coordinator is going to come in. They know who all needs to be copied on this stuff. All right, so moving on in terms of process notes. So that site visit, to review proposed work, worth noting that if your project's pretty small and it sounds like it's not really super significant, and it's just a slam dunk to just kind of clean up, pop some rocks and improve a section of really rugged trail that you're not really asking for that much. They may not need to do a site visit. As long as you give them the geographic data and some pictures and the form, they may just say, yeah, go ahead, that sounds great. So that on-site visit, when you're planning your project, there's some red flags and some pitfalls you can avoid. We talked about that threatened and endangered reptile habitat, so sunny and rocky with maybe a little bit less tree cover, especially on south-facing slopes. That's Snakesville. Not just timber rattlesnakes, it's copperheads, I want to say worm snakes, which are very small. They tend to hide under rocks. And then fence lizards. Those are the ones that I've encountered that can become stumbling blocks for projects. We've also had projects basically just not happen because of the entire location is within an area like that. Same story for large, expansive open talus fields. If there's huge talus fields and you're proposing to cross them, or harvesting large amounts of stone from them, there may be resource concerns there, because all those voids and overhangs around those piles of stone are nesting habitat, or at least hiding habitat for those critters, as well as Lord knows what else. And then another one that's might not be obvious, but is good to avoid is kind of on escarpments and cliff sides. If you're below them, be on the lookout for getting too close to large rock overhangs or anything that could be used as a shelter. And we're talking, could be used prehistorically or by Native Americans. They tend to not want proposed trail alignments to come too close to those, because they're not saying that definitely it was used by, by people in the past, but just the possibility, they would prefer to avoid it. So let's say they've, identified some red flags. Your natural resource specialist has come out for a site visit and they've said, well, not a fan of this, not a fan of that. What sorts of changes could you expect to have to make? So they could ask you to move the location or the, location or extent of your proposed trail or structure. We very frequently have to move proposed flag lines for trails, 50, 75, 100 feet away from a particular area in order to have it pass muster and alleviate those concerns. There may be limitations on where or how much stone or other natural materials. Pretty rare you're proposing to harvest a lot of timber, but usually it's stone. But they may say, no, you can't pull stone from there, that's quality habitat. Or they may say, you could pull some stone from there, but keep it limited and unnoticeable as much as you can. And especially, only pull stone that is fully embedded in the ground or either sitting flat on the ground. Anything that's piled up in those jumbles where there could be habitat underneath, to avoid pulling from that. In general, we've gotten so that we try to keep that as best practice anyway, just because we know that that's sensitive. Another one is if you're working just above bodies of water or wetland or within a wetland buffer, you may be required to install silt fence if you're excavating a large amount of soil and there's concern that it could wind up in the water body. Another one that's specific to mechanized trail building or mechanized assisted trail building is during the warmer months, it's required to have a snake monitor on hand to make sure that you're not disturbing threatened and endangered snakes. So you would need to have someone who is certified to serve as a snake monitor on site when that mechanized work is going. And I only know a small amount about it, but I just imagine them just kind of walking around looking, although I'm sure that's not what it actually consists of. Small thing, but it can be it can trip you up if you're not able to meet that requirement. So in general, some of these are easy to do, depending on what the situation is like or the nature of your proposal, or they could put you back to square one. You could have to start from zero and figure out how to square that circle and, you know, meet that trail need that you've identified without triggering some of these red flags or to get around them. Some other folks in terms of review and on-site, you know, just visiting these sites, some people that you would deal with in the Taconic region, you'd be dealing with Evan Thompson. He's the park manager for the Hudson Highlands and Fonsdog State Parks. And then usually a fellow named Jesse Jaycox, who is the wildlife biologist. He tends to work east of the river. He'll come down personally, even though he is statewide now, but he still puts on that personal touch, where he may designate someone to come down in his stead. It changes. I think Jesse may eventually not have enough time to do that himself. In the Palisades region, within the individual parks, you'd be dealing with Mike McElroy in Sterling Forest, or Mickey Cahill, the head ranger in Harriman State Park. And then for environmental review, you'd most likely be, at least initially, dealing with Ed McGowan, who is science director and also oversees the trailside museums and the zoo over in Bear Mountain, interestingly enough. And then environmental analyst Dan Lewis handles seeker and some of the other environmental review for projects. Occasionally, you may deal with someone working directly for PIPC, which is the Palisades Interstate Park Commission, which overlaps. It kind of is hand in glove with OPRHP and parks in that region. But in general, I don't think at this stage you would be dealing with them directly. So I'm not going to get too much into that. So more process notes. So seeker, talking a little bit more about that. If there's substantive concerns, if it's impacts are significant enough and you are not exempt because it's as part of it's already part of a master plan recommendation, that seeker process stands for State Environmental Quality Review. DEC actually conducts it, but it's a process that all state agencies, not all state agencies, MTA is exempt mostly, but activities by state agencies likely to impact the environment. And that means most trail projects of any real significant size. Real small stuff can probably skate and not trigger that, but most of the time, a lot of things are subject to seeker. Again, if it's part of a master plan process, you may not need to, and your regional trail coordinator can investigate and find out based on the nature and scale of your project if that's actually the case. And you know, if it is required, they can also help. You know, Valerie or Nate would help you navigate the filing and ask you to supply any additional materials that are needed in order to actually put in the paperwork to have that done. My experience dealing directly with seeker is somewhat limited, but in my experience, turnaround is variable depending on if it's fast tracked or not, or what the workload is by the people at DEC doing the work. I think you can safely count on a couple of months for them to actually go through and do it, though. I've seen it a lot faster, but not always. Some issues that we haven't touched on yet that I think are notable. So when dealing with streams, lakes, and wetlands, it's worth noting that anything that's potentially impacting named water bodies and wetlands, usually it's regulated by the DEC in New York. And anything that's potentially going to involve placing fill or fill material of any kind, if it's dirt, stone, what have you, in particular class A or B streams or any C class stream that is trout habitat, that's going to fall under their purview and potentially require a permit. And again, that resource, that interactive map, you click on a water body, click on a stream, it can tell you what class it is once you go into the data. In general, bridges across a water body span are okay, and don't require as much review, as long as the abutments at the ends are set back from the banks and they don't actually touch the waters or the banks themselves. Interestingly, this bridge in the picture has a pier in the center. I'm not exactly sure if that would count, as long as there's just one piling. So I'm kind of curious how that particular bridge went. Again, as I mentioned before, wooden structures to be installed, and they're going to exist in perpetuity, require submission of some kind of schematic. If it's a bridge or a boardwalk or something. Any structures that contact named water bodies in addition to DEC, they're going to need some sort of U.S. Army Corps of Engineer approval, because they also have jurisdiction over what they call named water bodies of the United States, or named water courses of the United States. So overall, this is another instance where the regional trails coordinator will help you navigate this or let you know what is going to be required. But just so you know, it's a possibility if you're getting into mucking around near named streams, near lakes, near wetlands, or talking about bridges. So just a few notes on implementation really quickly. Just remember, kind of goes without saying at this point in the presentation, don't start work until Regional Trails Coordinator has obtained all necessary approvals. And be sure to have any volunteers working on these projects with you fill out the correct volunteer service agreement for that region. So that's right there. That's a link that goes to a page that OPRHP has set up to fill out the volunteer service agreements for each year. Good idea to track and submit volunteer hours, particularly if you're with the trail conference, along with project progress pictures and measurements, so that the trails coordinator can keep tabs on how things are going. Be sure to keep on hand and use the OPRHP injury and illness report if you're working on their property, because you would be working under their workers' compensation agreement, and you would be covered by them, especially for people who maybe they don't have insurance or not the best insurance. It's very good to keep on hand, so that's linked there as well. And then finally, if once a project is completed, if it involves a reroute or a new trail, you're very likely to be asked to submit a GPS track of that so that they can update their records. Any questions really quick on any of that, or does anyone have anything to add before I move on? The rest of it goes very quickly, I promise.
You did a
Nope,
great
nothing.
job explaining my position.
I'm sorry, what was that?
You did a great job explaining my position.
Okay, great, thanks. Who else was that? Was that
Yeah, I was just saying no questions, so it's good.
all
Very
right,
informative.
fantastic. All right, so just a few things really quickly about some other jurisdictions. DEC does function at least a little similar to New York State Parks. You do typically work through the park supervisor, or can't remember what their titles are, manager, supervisor, superintendent, rather than a regional coordinator. But for the most part, their process is kind of run on the same rails. They focus very heavily on unit management plans for dictating what work can be done and what can't. And they're very much focused on keeping tight control of work that's done outside of existing trails. So reroutes, and especially new trails, are much more difficult to get approval for projects than work updating and improving or repairing existing trails. In general, so these have to be in the unit management plan unless there's a critical safety or resource risk, in which case they sometimes we'll work out some sort of waiver or a special circumstance approval. But they also have their own project work plan form. It's there to the left. I also attached that to the email I sent out previously, so I couldn't find it online. But it's the same sort of stuff. It's, you know, what is the facility description, GPS data, what sort of a work are you proposing to do, attach a map. So very familiar. Now DEC runs the seeker process, SEQR, but they're also subject to it or subjected to it. So any work that you propose also needs to be potentially reviewed in seeker. Now, you know, this is true everywhere, but there's some flexibility in how unit management plans and their regulations are implemented, or like what the gatekeeping's like by the individual park managers or the unit managers. So you may find a slightly different or more or less permissive culture in one region, you know, in region 3 versus region 4. So you will find that out once you actually talk to staff and feel out their willingness to give thumbs up or thumbs down. But New Jersey DEP. Now, in general, the regulations that govern work on trails is, you know, environmental protection based, not really written or instituted with rustic trail work in mind. A lot of it is more like work on like affecting coastal habitat, because it's a little bit more based down south. It's what they originally had in mind. Or they're talking about public works projects like civil infrastructure, like roads and buildings. And so they're not really kind of intended to govern a bunch of volunteers out there scratching in the dirt with hand tools. Technically on paper, it's covered by the land use regulation permits, or LURP for short. The process for going through to obtain a land use regulation permit is pretty long and demanding. You can look it up, like what it actually looks like, and partly because it has not really very good bearing on the sort of work that's being proposed. Park and regional superintendents do have some discretion in terms of what's actually required to go through the LURP process. In general, a lot of work gets done on New Jersey DEP land via what are called special use permits. You say, we're going out there, we're going to spend a day or 2 days, you know, doing this activity to improve the tread and put in some stepstones in this area. It's a special use permit. It's a good way to get work done. Some other relevant things to note are a lot of stuff in New Jersey is governed in anything related to a flood hazard zone or adjacent to it. So the Flood Hazard Control Act, if you're anywhere near a large water body, any work that you do is subject to the Flood Hazard Control Act. And that has to do with building structures above grade, or dumping fill if you are trying to do an elevated treadway or something like that. You may run into issues with that. And I'll skip down. When it comes to building bridges, in some cases, building small trail bridges up to a certain length, you are able to get around official permit applications by adhering to what's called permit by rule. So there's been an amendment to some of the regulations that allow for essentially an exemption for small trail bridges. So all you have to do is just document that we're building this bridge under permit by rule, and you are largely able to avoid some of the red tape a little bit. Final thing to note is the New Jersey Highlands Act, where the region of northern New Jersey that is in the Highlands area does have some additional regulations, and there's an additional management body that governs that, the New Jersey Highlands Council. They even have their own resource mapper that is useful. So if you're doing work in northern New Jersey, check to see if your area you're proposing your project is within the Highlands region. And you'll have to check and see what that implies for you. I can't recall off the top of my head all of the implications for that, but I think there is largely just an additional exemption process you need to file for in order to have all your T's crossed and I's dotted. The major takeaway is check with your park superintendent for whatever individual land parcel or park you're working in, because they probably have their own specific, understanding of how they implement these regulations or go through them, or which ones they have workarounds for if they've determined that and follow their lead. All right, so we are at the end of my official gum flapping, and I wanted to field questions, or maybe if people had some specific scenarios they wanted to go through, and based on everything I've laid out, if you wanted to just go kind of take it through the process and talk about what would be required.
Hey, Ben, this is Ed. I've got a question for you.
Sure.
So you were talking about park managers. So on the New York side, I know like Jen Silvestri is the Bear Mountain Park manager. Is there a manager for Harriman?
Right now, the kind of person who's most functionally in charge has been Mickey Cahill.
Okay.
But I don't think there is someone who has that title of park manager that I'm aware of. And in general, what this is trying to do is, I think, just make sure that there is consistency in process, and let the regional trails coordinators navigate that process internally, so that there's an easy, set of names that trail conference folks know and can deal with, and that there's kind of an overall kind of a broad view of what sorts of projects are on offer. And it doesn't always have to be, well, it's like, you don't have to go through the park manager as a gatekeeper before talking to someone who's coordinating all the work in the region. And it's like, they will do that for you.
Okay. No, I was just curious if there was a parallel manager.
Yeah, it's funny. Harriman, I mean, I'm finding interesting new things about Harriman all the time, but to my knowledge, that's one of the strange picadillos that they have. They have a head ranger.
All right, thanks.
All right, no problem. Any other questions or scenarios? Jackie, did you see that I answered your question about environmental impact statements?
Yeah, I was just wondering, yeah, it had come up with one of the grants on work, whether an environmental impact statement was required. So in your slide, you had the SECRA, the NEPA. Is an EIS part of NEPA?
EIS is part of NEPA. If you're going through a full, what's called an EA, or environmental assessment, the environmental impact statement is what comes out of that EA. So once they've if it's triggered and you're going through the EA, you then you fill out and submit an environmental impact statement, and then it's you either get approved or denied based on that.
Okay, and again, that's part of NEPA, right? That's at a federal level. Yep. Okay, thanks.
So again, this is my first time putting this on. I may have missed some stuff that folks may have expected to see, and if I did, I apologize. Also, there may be items that you feel maybe I got wrong. If you can feel free to tell me now, or you could always reach out afterwards to say, hey, you might want to revise that presentation to correct X or Y, because I will be doing this again and I want to be as accurate as I can. And I will try to find ways to jazz it up a little bit, put in dancing bears or whatever else I can do to make it a little bit more fun and interactive. But otherwise, if there's no one else with questions or input, I will go ahead and leave it there, and you can feel free to reach out to me if you think of anything or have questions about what we covered. All right. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Ben.
You're very
Thank
welcome.
you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye,
Enjoy the
everybody.
rest of
Thanks
your
so
weekend.
much.
Yes, thank
You
you all
too.
so much. I really
Take care,
appreciate
Ben.
it.
Take care.
Be well all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Happy holidays.
You too.